if you haven't seen already, and you can check Ed for a post, an announcement post about this. Over the weekend, yesterday, I published a recap video of last week, real short, about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes, just going really over some of the top level, high level concepts that we covered. Worth checking out just momentarily. Again, it's really short. Just kind of gives you an idea of what the week covered. If people respond well to that and like it, I do plan on doing more of those. Even if I'm not the active lecturer, even when Andrew's lecturing, I think we can figure out how to do those to cover that week's content. I will go ahead and share my screen. Will we have a quiz this Friday? Yes, I will cover that momentarily. Stay tuned. I'll go over the details of that. Okay. As I move things around, give me a second. Oh, all right. So today we're going to cover a real brief recap on CSS, and we're going to go into something that I started to introduce on Friday, which was this idea of using CSS for layout and getting things to move around on the web page using some special CSS rules, and we're going to call those flex. But first, what we're going to talk about, a couple of reminders. I will talk about the quizzes. Yes, we're going to have one. More details on the next slide. I'll pause for questions and we'll go into CSS. So CP1, the Creative Project 1, our first assignment is due on Wednesday and it locks on Friday. By lock, we mean that no more submissions will be accepted after Friday. So as a reminder, between Wednesday and Friday, if you submit, that will use up late days. If you submit anytime between now and Wednesday at 11 p.m. Pacific time, that is all good and no late days will be spent. So everyone should have access to Gradescope. If you don't, please either let your TA or us know. Another reminder that office hours are available after lecture every Monday, Wednesday, Friday with both Andrew and myself. Things have been pretty quiet over the last few, so I just wanted to make another plug for it, that we do have this time dedicated for being available to answer your questions or talk about whatever you want to talk about. Links to those Zoom calls are in the pinned Ed post. And you can get to those there. I already mentioned the recap video. Another plug for Section, and I know a lot of folks are going to Section, and that's amazing. And we're seeing a lot of really great engagement there and a lot of really good discussion. And so I just want to make another plug for it, that this is your opportunity to really get some guided practice with TAs and other classmates on the content. These are not recorded, they are active. You're around doing things and talking about things on the course, and that getting that practice in is going to make doing the assignments and doing the quizzes and doing anything else with the course so much easier once you have that practice in. Getting some of that muscle memory into what HTML and CSS and eventually JavaScript look like. That's going to be really important and really, really helpful. Couple questions. Don't see the slides posted on the webpage calendar. Yes, I forgot to add them to the calendar just before lecture. If Andrew or one of the TAs is listening, could you add it to the calendar, please? And all right, someone answered that question. Great. During lecture, also, please feel free to ask questions. You can either type hand into the chat and we'll get to you when it's noticed and there's a reasonable pause. And we'll answer the question as we get to it. So those quizzes. Lots of notes on the quizzes. So we do plan on having one this Friday, and the format of those is going to be that it's administered through Gradescope. And It's not going to be timed, but you'll have 24 hours to submit it. So we will open up the quiz right around lecture time on Friday, and it'll be available for the following 24 hours. Given that it's kind of this asynchronous thing where we're not watching you take the quiz, we're just letting you take it on your own time within the next day. They are definitely open note, and we expect you to reference your notes, reference course slides, and reference recordings and that sort of thing. But we're not expecting it to be open internet. And what I mean by that is you might search for answers to questions on the internet. There are lots of technically right answers out there. But the only ones that'll be accepted are the ones that we cover in the class. And we're all good at searching the internet, and we'll be able to see the difference between an answer that you've written versus an answer that's been copy pasted from the internet. So no internet answers will be accepted, but we do expect you to be referencing notes and whatnot through the course of that 24 hours. The quizzes will be approximately 5 points, one per question. They'll, so that it's relatively lightweight. The answers will be short form. So expected to write like a 1 to 2 sentence answer or so for each one. We're going to cap them. So it'll be the sort of thing where we won't grade or look at answers over a certain length for those answers. So that's the quizzes. And I know that's a lot of information really quickly. So there's a couple questions here. First, is the quiz timed? Yes and no. Once you start it, there's not necessarily a time, but you'll have 24 hours and it'll lock at the end of that 24 hours. Section activities available after section. We'll post the slides at least to the calendar, and those will reference and have links to some of the activities. Mostly the questions and answers, but actually, are we posting the activities themselves? Okay, Tal's answering all on the slides. Great. Christopher, you have a question.
Yes, I was wondering if we can have our slides open in another window so we can reference them, or if we have to directly copy them into our notebook if we want to use them as a reference for quiz answer.
I'll put it this way: we won't know the difference. I'll put it a different way, which is you are able to reference course resources, whether you took a note about it or you're looking up the slides. We will structure the questions in such a way that it probably won't be an exact copy paste from one of our resources, so reference what you need to get the right answer, to figure out what the right answer is. Today's slides aren't on the calendar yet. Yep, we should be working on them. Oh yeah, Tal put a link there. So if you're not in the chat but are listening to me, you can open up the chat and get a link to today's slides. This is just the questions section of today's lecture, so I'll leave the quizzes slide up because that's what we're discussing. Other questions? MDN reference. I guess it really depends on the specific question. We won't necessarily be asking you to say something like, what does this exact tag or this exact selector do? We might be asking you something more conceptual. In that case, it's going to change how you look at and how you interpret that reference. And so we often use MDN reference in the slides as go here to look up how to do this thing. So that is a course resource. But what we don't want to see is, let's suppose that a question were, what is HTML? There is an MDN reference page on what is HTML. We will not be wanting to see just the copy paste of the first two sentences of that page. Now, that's not a type of question we will ask. That's not the question we will ask, but it's an example of the kind of referencing of a resource that we don't want to see. You're welcome to look up MDN for CSS rules. That's fine. Will we have to cite anything during the quizzes? If we want you to cite something, we will say in the question to cite sources. Generally, again, it's going to be types of questions where you won't necessarily have to cite something, but we want you to be thinking about and interpreting something that we've talked about that week. Could I give an example for the quiz sometime this week? Yes, I will give an example. Not today, because on the spot, I don't want to come up with a question that we're actually going to use. But by Wednesday, we'll come up with an example question. Alex, you raised your hand.
It got answered. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Are there coding questions? We won't be asking you to write an immense amount of code. We're going to expect that the quizzes take probably about 30 minutes or so to complete. And so within that time frame, if you have 5 questions, that means that a single question shouldn't take too long. And so because of that, we won't be expecting too much coding. We might ask you to write something that looks like code, but we're not going to ask you to write this entire web page or write this whole amazing thing. And so sort of is the answer to that question, but mostly no. It'll be a mixture of code and sentences, trying to get an idea of how well you understand the content. So our primary goal here with the quizzes is to assess how well you're doing in understanding the content. The actual practice of applying the content will be left for the creative projects and the homework assignments. And so you can expect those two formats to be a little bit different, where the assignments are very heavy on coding and practice and figuring out the right tag or figuring out the right selector or figuring out the right property, whereas the quizzes are going to be more high level, like, why would you do this thing? Yes, I will post the quiz information after lecture. The quiz, for accessing them, we will just provide a link to them and you can click on it and go to that from there. Oh, I see Tal answered that right afterwards. I'm going to pause for just a few seconds to see if anyone else has any more questions. So we're definitely here in the questions category. So since we're in questions, if you have questions not just on the quizzes, but on the content, that's okay too. Can we post ed announcements on Canvas as well? That's a great idea. Yes, I think we can do that. Try to get more visibility to things, because ed and Canvas are not necessarily tied together. So trying to get those out, yes, we can do that. Thank you for the suggestion, Lauren. Is it possible for me to post the readings, for us to post the readings earlier? Yes, absolutely. Just to be honest, totally forgot about them for today. But yes, we can absolutely post the readings earlier. Is there a coordinate system in HTML CSS where you can place text in the exact position? Not really. Kind of, but not really. And so we're going to start to see today ways that you can do some layout and positioning of things that is a little bit more flexible, so shall you say. And so you can kind of do exact pixel math to get things where you need them to be, but we'll look at ways that make it a little bit easier. Okay, Connor's got that one. Okay, let's continue on then. So as I mentioned, I do want to do a brief overview, a brief review of some CSS things. So we've already covered a lot about different selectors of CSS and what they can do. So the really basic ones are things like select all of the paragraph tags and apply this particular style, or select just this tag via an ID, of which there can only be one in the entire document. Or you could select a group of elements with a class, and there can be some number of them, and they don't all have to be the same type of element. They all just have the same class. So those are the really simple ones, and they're all based largely on this notion of the document object model, which is this this hierarchy and the structure of elements within the page. So, for example, we might have this div at the top with an ID of container, and within that div there are two different divs, and then within each one there are also three more. And so you get this tree, and you can select different elements based on their relationship in this tree. Some of them are really easy, like the ID, you just select it with the ID selector, and that's going to give you just that particular element. And then if you want to get the divs underneath that, and I'm going to try something new here and see if anyone has the answer. How would I select these two particular elements? We have use the greater than, we have div, we have column. Yeah, a lot of these are correct. Yeah. Yes, I love the engagement we're getting here with everyone trying to answer in. So there's a couple different ways we can do that. We can use the class selector, and that's just going to get all of the classes. And yeah, we could be a little bit more specific if we wanted to here and say, I specifically want the divs with class column that are children of the ID container. And so we could do that, and then we could be a little bit less specific and say, I just want the divs that are children of the container. There's a number of different ways, and so this is a common pattern that we're going to see across CSS, is that there's going to be multiple ways. And as I mentioned on Friday, we're generally going to lean towards the thing that is going to reduce redundancy so that we can only specify the fewest amount of rules to get what we want, but also being as specific as we need to be without being too specific. Okay. And then when we want to get down to these leaf nodes, yeah, ID container, the children of those, the children of those. That's yeah. So again, already in chat, we're seeing a few different ways to accomplish this. Yep, we got them. Hooray. Um, so, but each of these ways, all of these ways, are all based on the relationship of where these elements appear in relationship to other elements in this document object model, this hierarchy and tree of elements through the document. And things start to get a little bit more complicated. You could also select the parents and the children via the comma groupers. Nikhil has a question: how would I select just 4, 5, 6? You can. This is where the pseudo selectors are going to come in, where we might want to say. And again, it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. But one potential option is to say, give me the second child of the ID container, and then give me the divs underneath that. But there are multiple ways to do that. That's one particular one. In that case, you might want to consider, why do I just need 4, 5, 6 rather than 1, 2, 3? Is there a different way that I could structure my HTML that would make more logical sense, more semantic sense on what these things mean, so that I can have my CSS rules be a little bit simpler. CSS rules can get complicated really fast, and so if you can keep them simpler sooner, that'll help a lot. Yes, to echo Tal's answer in the chat, we don't necessarily want to save chat, but we can recap some of these answers, both in slides and with a post on Ed, or come to office hours. Another plug. Okay, so that's our brief recap on CSS. And so we're going to transition now to a different part of CSS. We've gone over selectors and how to choose the right elements to style things a certain way. But that's just how they look, like with their color or with their font size. And we can also use CSS to move things around the page and get them to appear in different locations on the page. So what we're going to start with is we'll really quickly overview the box model, and then move into layout with CSS. The box model will give us an initial idea of how much space something takes up on the page, and that'll help us understand where and how they relate to other things when they appear. Okay, yeah, I think so. Everyone's more or less on the same page with what is the box model. Yeah, it's this, as we go back to the slides, it's this idea that the content on the page, each element of the content is kind of wrapped in these boxes. And the content itself is one box. And then as we move out, we have the content, and then we have some space between the content and the border. That's called the padding. We have the border itself, and we have some space between the border and whatever comes next. And that's what we call the margin. Some of these are kind of difficult to pinpoint, depending on whether it's a block element, an inline block element. And so for me, I found often the easiest way is to override a border and set a border somewhere, so you can tell exactly where that part is. Once you know where the border is, then you can get an idea of where the padding is, how much padding there is, and where the margin is as well. There's a suggestion from Sandy on the polling. Yes, I will look into that for the next poll that I do. Thanks for the suggestion. So that's the box model, giving us an idea of how much space things take up. And so as we transition into talking about layout, there's a number of reasons why this is really important, and it's not just for how things look. So here's a particular example of an interesting page. I wonder if it's still available. And is this good layout? No, I don't really think it is. Style is subjective. Yeah, it's getting a lot of good responses. It does have some good pictures. It's interesting to note that when we go in and look at the page source for this, it is kind of all over the place. And the first thing that I notice here is, I'm going to make this bigger. The first thing that I really notice here is this tag here. These tables are an older style of kind of getting that layout of getting things to go where we want them to be. And this particular website uses tables everywhere, and it just keeps going. There's a table within the table, and this particular one only has like one row. And it just keeps going with more divs and more tables and tables within divs, etc. It just it's a mess. And like, this gives me as someone who's done a lot of development, kind of like this weird feeling, like this creepy feeling, and but that's from lots of experience with HTML. And so I want to open it up for some thoughts and questions here. Why is using table for getting this layout? And I'm like, I'll return this to its original size. Why is using something like table and a bunch of random divs not necessarily the greatest idea for layout? It's not responsible at all. It's not a very flexible structure. It's hard to upkeep. Nothing can overlap. Yeah. No semantic meaning. It's limited to square. Doesn't let other developers know what each element is. Yeah, exactly. That's the same idea as semantic. Too much padding and margins, ugly font. Yes, exactly. So all these are great answers. There's a reason this website hasn't changed in however long it's been available for. I don't know when it was first. Oh, it's actually relatively recently, more so than I expected. But there's a reason it still kind of looks like this, and it's really hard to update. And if I shrink down the web page, yeah, it doesn't move at all. Everything is just the same. It's not great. And so there's lots of other reasons as well, like that semantic reason that a couple of you pointed out. One of the reasons semantics is important is because of accessibility and making sure that all of the content on the page has some kind of meaning associated with it. If it's just a div and a table, those are not terribly meaningful, especially div. It's just div. We haven't really talked about it, but it's really just a group of tags. It's a subdivision of the page, which is where the name div comes from, and that's all it is. A table, meanwhile, we expect it to be a table of data, or like a spreadsheet table, where we have headers, and the headers relate to a series of like numeric values underneath them, like an accounting sheet or something like that. And so when we go to this Gates and Fences site and we see a bunch of these tables, especially when they're just one row and whatnot, that kind of breaks what the meaning of a table is. So that's a counterexample. It's not great. To continue on the notion of accessibility and being important, and it relating to layout, there's things like healthcare.gov. When it launched in 2018, there's it's a healthcare website. It's a place you go to sign up for healthcare, and it really needs to be accessible to everyone. It's a government website that almost everyone needs to go to at some point, and making sure that it's available for anyone to use is very useful. So as you're considering what to do for layout and how to design your web page, consider these more difficult or easier, depending on what reference you're looking at. Consider these different resources and how you felt as a user in trying to use the more difficult ones. Check out the link for more research. So we're going to start a little bit on talking about some layout and responsive design here. So we're going to look at an example of taking something, or how we could use CSS layout rules to go from something that is just top down based on the order of the elements that we listed to something that feels a little bit better. So for example, if I click on this and we resize the page, it's going to nicely move things around so that, or depending on the size of that page. And there's lots of different ways to do layout in CSS. The first and most basic one is just choosing the right elements, whether we're using a block element like the paragraph tag, or an inline element like span or a for anchors and links. And then after that, it's examining the box model and trying to make sure you understand how much space something takes up, especially for something like a block element that's by default going to take up the entire width of the page or its parent element. Understanding the box model will help you figure out how to modify that and how it's going to affect the other elements around it. What we're going to introduce today is something called Flex, which is what the Coffee Noodles website was written with. And then there are a couple others we're not going to touch on too much. You can do some absolute positioning, referencing an earlier question in the chat. Yes, you can specify, I want this element to be 20 pixels down and 30 pixels over. That's certainly possible. We're not going to talk too much about that as a current practice for doing layout. There's another option called float. We'll discuss it momentarily. And there's a brand new option, relatively new option called grid, where you can sort of lay things out almost as if you were thinking about them in the sense of tables, but it's with a grid. We're not going to talk about that one. We're going to try to keep things simple and only talk about Flex. So we're going to start with some building blocks. So like our earlier examples, we have a div with a container, and we've styled these such that it's a series of boxes. Okay. But why boxes? There's lots of different ways to figure out and learn how to style your page. Using boxes is nice in part because we have the box model. And so the poll where I asked, what is the box model? It's in part based on this option A, where everything kind of is a box. And because everything's kind of a box, it's great to think about things in boxes and see the boxes move around when we're talking about layout in CSS. it also helps when you have that box defined and then you put some text into it to see how that text interacts based on whether it's doing a block or an inline. And so I believe this link, and so from the slides, this link to the box layout thing is available, and so it's a nice place to start when you're trying to figure out these layout rules. So there's an older way of doing layout, which I referenced as being float. This float model was this idea of, what if we had all of our boxes in a line and we could just float one of them up? And then everything else is going to move around based on how that thing floated up and how it was able to shift to fill the remaining space. And so, for example, this is an element where no float has been defined at all. We have this blue box, and it is a block element. And so because it is a block element, it takes up the entirety of the width of the parent element. So you can see the blue box was defined, and then it has its entire own line, and then after that is where the next elements begin. But if we take that same thing and we add a float to it, we're going to say the CSS now, and I'll highlight the float here and maybe make this a little bit bigger. This float rule, this float left rule, has said that we really only want it to take up as much space on the left that it needs, not the whole space, but kind of shift it all to the left. And then because we've kind of floated it up, everything else kind of fills in and takes up that space that it would have taken up. But because we floated it up, it now doesn't necessarily need that. And so, by the way, these demos are brought to us by Melissa Hovick, who's one of the previous instructors for the course and a current TA. These are wonderful examples and very useful. CodePen, if you haven't seen it yet, is a good resource for just trying things out and playing around with code. So links to these are in the slides. Frost has a question on, does float account for differences in z-axis? That's actually an answer I don't know. Andrew, do you happen to know that off the top of your head?
I wish I did, but I can't say that I do. That is a good question.
It is a very good question. We'll follow up afterwards with thoughts on that. So in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. So by default, when we had this starter list of boxes where we had our 5 boxes in a column, if we look at the source for this, go to view page source, bigger, you can see they're just specified top down like this. And so, and again, because they are block elements, the browser nicely laid them out such that they each have their own spot horizontally, and it ends up being that they all come into a column. But how do we get to something like this? One option is to try to float all of the boxes to the left or right, and try to figure out the right set of float rules to get them to go into a row. We can also, because they're block elements, we could change the display from block to inline. Let's see if my inspector will allow me to do this easily. So when I change all of the blocks to an inline And I'll make my inspector bigger. You can see that we all moved up into the same line. And that's because when we have a block display, which I'll change it back to that, which is the default for a div, it takes up the entire width, and it forces the next thing to go up on its own line. When you do it inline, it's inline. It's within the same line. So that works, but there's still more solutions. So slides ask, what do we do if we just had float left? Let's give it a shot. Notice how the background has now not contained all of the blocks. And so the reason for this is that floating. So we've taken these things and we moved them out of the same layer as that background. And so it's kind of confusing in some ways on how this works. There's multiple things happening here. So there's a simpler, easier way that we can look at doing this. I'm skimming the questions real quick. Nicholas has a good question. If blocks take up the whole width, why doesn't the green-white box fill up the width of the parent div? And so, yeah, let's, I'm going to take that out. So if you use this tool, select an element on the page to inspect it, you can hover over specific elements and it'll tell you exactly how much space it takes up. So you notice I go over the green box, and it actually is taking up the entirety of the rest of the width within the gray box. But because we only specified, so David here is correct, because we only specified the actual width as 80 pixels, the container of things that have the background color green, which is just this 80 pixel box, is only going to take up 80 pixels. The actual space that the element takes up on the page, though, is the entire width of its container. So that's why it's going to be important and more interesting to play with the code, open up the slides, find the link to boxes_starter.html, and open up the inspector as I have done here, and play around with some of the different width and float and display options. While we're here, I do want to mention something else, which is display none. And we'll talk more about this in the future, but display none removes this element from the DOM tree. And so because it's now removed, it does not take up any space, and therefore our gray background collapses down to the smallest it can be. We'll talk more about that in the future, but I did want to mention it since we were talking about those. Does it also remove the children? Yes, I believe it does. Andrew's nodding, so I'm assuming that's the right answer.
Yes, it'll also hide everything that's inside the parent container.
We'll get to other ways to have things not displayed in the future, but I did want to at least introduce that. So point of this all is that getting things to be exactly where you want them to be and size the correct way can sometimes be challenging, especially when we start to get to how do you center things on the page. And so this is one example. I'm going to move on because we don't have much time. So With float, doing something like this, what's shown on the slides, where we have some amount of space equally distributed through between and around each and every box. We could play around with the margins. We could set it to display inline to make sure they're all in the same line. We could play around with margins and the padding and the border sizes to make sure and calculate how many pixels each one of these needs to be. After we do that, we could maybe convert it to a percentage so that it actually cleanly changes based on how wide the thing is. That's a lot of work, and it's likely to change, and it's likely to change how our page behaves when it gets bigger or smaller. And this is hard because not all screens are made the same way. Your phone might be bigger or smaller than someone else's phone. It's certainly smaller than the computer that you may or may not be on. It could be smaller than someone else's computer screen. And so we just don't know. So there's lots of different ways we can display things. We've talked about inline. We've talked about block. We just showed none. And flex is one that's going to be a little bit more flexible. So flex is this method of laying things out that's based on two main concepts. One is that we have a container and we have things within that container that can move around. So we have flex containers and flex items. And within a container, we have two axes. We have the x-axis and we have the y-axis. We primarily call those, though, the cross-axis and the main axis. There's a reason for that, and we'll get to that in a second. There's a bunch of properties that we can define here that define where along those axes the items will fall. So we start with defining a container as being display flex. So whatever thing that CSS rule is on is now a flex container. Within that container, then we can say how we want the items within that container to align. We can say that on the main axis, we want the items to all end up at the end of that axis using justify content, or we can specify on the cross axis, so the perpendicular axis to it. So we'll see examples in a second. With align items, we can say which way they can go. So let's drop over to here. I'm going to change actually not this one. I'm going to change the overall container for these divs. I'm going to move it to a flex container. You can already see immediately that all of the things, all of these individual divs, I have not changed them to an inline display. They are still block display, but I've changed their container to a flex. And I'm going to change the width to 100% so we can see it take up the whole thing. Oops. I'm going to add a padding so it takes up, so we have some space on either end. Which I'll do is 20 pixels. We'll go find my container again. And if I do justify content, and again, you can get a nice autocomplete here by using the Chrome inspector tools. And then we can try to play around with things to see. They're too high. My zoom level is too high. Go ahead. Oh, someone unmuted. Do you have a question? Oh, it was my echo. Great. Okay. So we have our various different flex rules that we can specify in things like justify content to get things to have space or show up at the end or show up at the beginning of our flex container. And I do know we're over time. I do want to respect that. So the slides have a bunch of reference rules to give on Flex, and we will get more practice with Flex in section tomorrow. And there's a couple of resources listed on the website for playing around with and practicing Flex. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for being with us in lecture today and for all of your questions and engagement. Again, we really, really appreciate all of the engagement we have in chat and all the questions that you ask. It really makes us feel like we're all here together in person, even though we're via these screens. So I will post the slides to the calendar. And as usual, I will stay on for another 5-10 minutes.